factors that influence intelligence. Now, we've started talking about the different models of intelligence, but now the factors that influence intelligence, can you imagine? Many societies strive to have an equal society. But is it truly equal if some people have higher levels of intelligence than others? Now, this creates both an ideological but also economic problem for a lot of people. Now, if we look at factors that influence intelligence, we firstly have to look at nurture versus nature. Remember, this is the debate that says, to what extent is nature responsible for our intelligence or the traits that we've inherited from our parents? So it's a genetically determined factor, whereas nurture is our environment, our upbringing, our life experiences. Those are the things that shaped us that way. So there is this debate as to whether it's nature or nurture. We know already that the two actually work together, but today we're going to look at to what extent intelligence is influenced by nature and nurture. So the first things we are going to look at are the biological factors that influence intelligence. Genetic influence is very, very profound. If there is only a slight genetic variation, like in the case of Down syndrome, you can see where there's an extra gene that will influence the appearance, but also the intellectual capability of the child. So, with these two young people, you can see they're quite high functioning, but there is that extra chromosome actually has a massive influence on their intellectual ability. And people with Down syndrome have different levels of functioning ability. So there are very low levels of functioning ability and very high levels of functioning ability. So you can see that just that one genetic difference has a massive influence. Now, the Human Genome Project gave us a lot of interesting information about this. So the Human Genome Project is actually a project that tried to map the human genome. They wanted to find out which gene affects which part of your development. So in this project, they found that a variety of genes affect intelligence, but they are heavily influenced by environmental factors. Therefore, people who inherit positive IQ will do better than children with negative IQ in the same environment. So if two children, like in your case, come to private school, if you're in that environment, if you have positive IQ, you will still do better than the person who has negative IQ. But can you imagine these same two children in an impoverished situation? Some of them with positive IQ will still do better than those with negative IQ in the same environment. Heritability. Remember, this is what you inherit from your parents. So how much does heredity or heritability contribute to the intelligence expressed as a coefficient from 0 to 1? 0 means that heredity has no influence, and 1 means heredity has 100% influence on intelligence. So scientists have tried to work out to what extent does this work. So when we look at neuroanatomy, and we'll go back to what extent heritability influences intelligence, we first have to look at this. Here is a study on Albert Einstein's brain. Now, when Albert Einstein died of heart failure in 1955, and he was 76 years old, his brain was kept at Princeton University after the autopsy. But in 1996, his brain characteristics were compared with those of people of normal intelligence who had agreed to donate their bodies to medical research. So Einstein's brain bottom was very different from people of normal intelligence at the top. So you can see here is Einstein's brain, and there are people of normal intelligence brain. You can see that this blue part, which controls the parietal lobe, and it is the inferior parietal lobe, and this is used for visuospatial thinking, mathematical thought, and for imagining how things move in space. The blue area was much larger in Einstein's brain than in a normal brain, and researchers hypothesized that this increased his ability to imagine objects in space. I also need you to just take into consideration whether it was because Einstein was born like that he could have a thought like, what is it like to ride on a light beam? Or did that develop because of all his visuospatial thinking? That we still can't know, but we do know that the end product of his brain was that, yes, that inferior parietal lobe was bigger than that of other people's. O'Boyle in 2005, he did a study on some students who were gifted in mathematics. And it seemed like they had stronger processing power in the right hemisphere and more communication and activation between the two hemispheres. So to them, that showed that mathematical ability was actually in the brain. And that, of course, could be inherited. So neuroanatomy gave us that perspective that yes, certain intelligence abilities lie in the brain. Then come the twin studies. Now, twin studies are excellent, as you know already, that fraternal twins, remember, are people where it's a boy and a girl or a boy and a boy, but they are not developed from the same cell. So they're not genetically identical. They're very similar, but not genetically identical. That's why fraternal twins can be a boy and a girl, or two boys or two girls, but they're not genetically similar. But identical twins, both of them come from monozygotic fertilized embryo that actually split, and those two then developed with identical genetic features. So they wanted to find out if we could study these kids, we could find out to what extent intelligence is determined by genetics. Because fraternal twins have different genetics but still similar. Identical twins have definitely the similar genetics. So the Minnesota twin study, Thomas Bouchard and David Lycan, they at the University of Minnesota, they tried to determine which characteristics were inherited and which we acquired. So in the the early 1900s, lots of adoptions happened all over the country, and it wasn't policy at that stage that children who were adopted out could actually go to the same household. Today, we try to keep families together because we know of the psychological impact, but back then, sometimes they would split identical twins and one would grow up in a different part of the country. This was a very sad event, but this created an amazing opportunity for the Minnesota twin study. So they hypothesized that even if identical twins were reared apart, they should exhibit the same traits in many areas due to the fact that they share 100% of their genetic blueprint. Those traits that differed were due to environmental influences. Have a look at this graph on what they found. It is amazing. So if there were identical twins that were reared together, right? Remember the mean IQ score similarity and genetic relationship. If they were raised together, so it's 100% overlap, you can see that probably about 87% of them had similar IQ scores. Then they studied the twins that were separated. They were reared apart in different households, different environments, but they are 100% genetic overlap, so they are identical twins, not reared together, and you can still see it's about a 72% similarity between them. Then they started looking at fraternal twins, so they're at least 50% genetically similar. They looked at them, and you can see that even fraternal twins are around 60% similar IQ, which is not even close to identical twins being reared apart. Siblings reared together, these are just normal siblings, right? And they also have 50% inheritance, the same. They're just below 50%. But then siblings reared apart, now you see that the difference between IQ starts becoming quite big. Biological parent and child live together. There you can see that has a strong influence, well, it's a 40% influence. And Then a 40% correlation in intelligence. Biological parent and child lived apart, and you can see that already has an effect if you didn't live with your biological parent. Adoptive parent and child live together. You can see it's the same as biological parent and child lived apart. And adoptive siblings reared together. You can see much stronger effect there, right? That how they were brought up, you can see it's in these low levels, still the same. And then cousins reared apart. So there's just a 12.5% genetic similarity. It even has a lower correlation than adoptive kids being reared together. Now, these studies fascinated people. It changed the way that children are raised because they realized you want to raise them together and you want to raise them with their biological parents. So that is why policy today with adoption has become really, really complicated because they try to keep families together and they try to put off adoption until it is absolutely necessary. Now, let's look at nurture. Environmental influences on intelligence. I'm going to give you a few seconds to think for me, to name some factors that you think will create good environments and bad environments for the development of intelligence. So I'm going to give you about 10-15 seconds just to think, what would you do to create an environment that would be good for your child's intelligence to be at its peak? Take these 10 seconds, think about it. Did you come up with something? Now, I'll tell you a fascinating story. I remember when my wife was pregnant with our child, I was living in the UK and I was working at a school there. And we were sitting there in the staff room, and then I just said, "Oh, I am so sick of steamed salmon because my wife just eats steamed salmon all the time, and because she checks what the level of the baby's development is, and at this stage the brain is developing, so she's eating all this steamed salmon." And I complained about me being sick of steamed salmon. Should probably not complain about eating steamed salmon. Then one of the pregnant ladies who sat in the staff room with me, she was one of the helpers at school, and she was heavily pregnant, and she was sitting there eating chicken and chips, and she turned to me with a face of shock and said, "So does what you eat influence your baby?" I was fascinated. I didn't realize that there were people who didn't realize that the food you eat would influence the development of your child. So this is why I think this is really essential. I think all people should have this level of education as to what gives your child the best start in life. So, if a mother has a very supportive environment in which she is happy, supported, that has a positive effect on the child. Of course, if she feels isolated, she feels like there's not enough income, she's in a desperate situation, even before the baby is born, this will have a really negative effect on the child. If a child grows up in a colorful, stimulating environment where they can play with different blocks, sounds, smells, textures that they are exposed to, this will stimulate the brain to develop even better. If you have fathers actually play a really important role in the development of children, especially studies have found if the father reads with the children. Because they just usually assume mum loves me anyway, and fathers are usually the first people you have to work to get their approval. But fathers have a big influence. So if there's a supportive father in the relationship, that has a very positive effect on the children. Then being together in a happy, well-adjusted family with a good diet, very, very important for mental development. Now, can you imagine poor children who are in refugee camps or in war zones? That is not good because your body is flooded with cortisol, you're just in survival mode, there's no time to really sit and develop all these skills that'll help you. If you struggle with abandonment and deprivation, if your diet is just fast food or anything that comes up with very little vegetables and fruits in it, of course, that is going to have a massive effect on your level of intelligence. So you can see that environment does have an effect. Now, you may say, oh, I know someone who's really smart and they just eat junk food all the time. Yes, that is true. Can you imagine how smart they would be if they had a very balanced diet? So in the estimate, can you remember we asked the question, to what extent does genetics and environment influence intelligence? So they did some calculations. So here's your heritability coefficient. Remember, 0 means that heredity has nothing to do with it, and it's 100% the environment. If it's 1, it means it's 100% heredity and 0% environment. And these are the ones in between. Now, the estimates we have at this stage is, the high estimate is that it's about 70% heredity and 30% environment. So that's a high estimate. The low estimate is that it's 50-50. Half genetics, half environment. So that is why governments drive incredibly hard to get good early childhood education and good equal education for everybody in society. Can you imagine if you're looking for a society where people can rise from poverty or have equality with others? If it is this low estimate of 50-50, you want to at least make sure that the bit that you can control, the environment, helps the child as much as you possibly can, because you cannot control the genetic inheritance. Now, here is the reaction range. Reaction range is how much of your intelligence is determined and how high can your intelligence go. Now, the research that they've done suggests this, that you are born with a reaction range. So you have an absolute top ability and a low ability. So if you go, like in Tom's case, his ability is not spectacular IQ score-wise, but because he has an enriched environment, he is right at the top of what he can intellectually achieve. And they're saying this reaction range says that you have an intellectual top, right? Beyond that, you cannot go because you are genetically governed to only be able to achieve a certain level of intelligence. Now, if you look at Alice, Alice has the potential to have genius intelligence above 145. But because she comes from a deprived environment, she's only 125, which is still smart as, right? Academically, she does really well, but there is so much more. If she came from an enriched environment, Alice could actually sit out here and perform way better. You can see in the average performance that the kids kind of just reach an average level. In the enriched environment, the kids go closer to what their actual potential could be. So that is why if you have a peaceful household with supportive parents who value your education, value your diet, and they try and help you as best you can, that enriched environment helps you way more. And even that inequality has a big difference. Now, if you look at Ted, Ted doesn't have even close to the intelligence that Alice has, but because Ted has an enriched environment, he's doing slightly better than Alice, who has way more potential than him. Obviously, you can think politically and socially, this has a huge influence on how we run social policy, but also in how we treat people and how we try to educate them. So, as we consider this, I want you to start thinking, what will I do one day to influence my children? What will I do to give them the best level of intelligence that they can possibly have? And what can I do to maximize my intelligence so that I get to the top of my reaction range? Now, please go back to the Google Classroom and complete the activity that has been set for you.